Welcome, everybody. This is Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors.
And this is Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors Group.
We'd like to welcome you to our K-12 Politics and Tech video series.
Our objective is to give you the absolute latest of what's going on in Sacramento that affects public school districts, obviously, and as well as all the technology stuff that's going on that's so vital to delivering for kids these days.
And remember, if you find these videos useful, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share out over social media. You're our marketing team. We appreciate your support, and let's go ahead and get started. All right, welcome everybody. This is Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors, back with another episode of K-12 Politics and Tech. As always, Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors, is here, co-host of the show. Kevin, glad to have you here.
Good to be with you, Tim.
Yeah, and it's been busy run in November. Lots of conferences, I'm sure, for all of you and for us. But there's a little thing called the elections in November, and this is our first broadcast since those elections. And Kevin, just wanted to get a 30,000 foot view from you around DC and the outcomes of those elections in DC politics for us.
Right. So, one of the things that we're hopeful for as we go into a brand new session of Congress is trying to approach some things that will benefit education to the degree we can do it on a bipartisan basis. And that is that obviously there were a lot of initiatives last year that were pushed by, and some of them by the Biden administration, that were just incredible for schools, but we couldn't get any traction on them because of sort of the nature of some of the political fights that were happening. The president had a lot of major asks, including Build Back Better. He had his infrastructure package. He had a number of different things going simultaneously. So it meant big priorities that we had, like, for instance, full funding of special ed and a number of other things, were just not going to get done because they were just simply lower on the attention span list for Congress in the political fights that were being picked. The president got a lot of things done, but we think that we're only going to make any really significant gains going forward. Obviously, with the House controlled by Republicans, we've got to get Republican co-authors or authors of major legislation that capitalizes on this thing. So one of the things that a lot of our clients across the state, school districts, know this, that we're going to be making a major push on special education and the idea of full funding for special ed. But the recipe to success, we think, is going to be bipartisan. Now, Virginia Fox, who is sort of poised to become the new chair of the House Education and Labor Committee, is sort of no stranger to some of the issues around special ed. We're hoping that we can identify the school districts that correspond to what will be the new members of the House of Representatives on those key committees and get those districts. We're actually going to work on it from California, getting those districts queued up to communicate with their members of Congress, with Chairman Fox, if she ends up securing the chairmanship, which we think is very likely, and then getting the people like Jared Huffman from California and other members from California who have been real leaders, on this issue from our state, back involved again with the full funding for special ed, that we can maybe make some progress in this Congress. One of the things that we do know is sort of signals are already being detected that we're not going to be looking forward to this next year as being a reauthorization year on IDEA, which is way overdue. I think it'd be a great thing if it was, because we'd get a little bit more bipartisan flavor to a reauthorization, which has a balance between the needs of advocacy groups and those of us that are, on the governance side of public education. Sometimes those reauthorizations become very lopsided and end up being filled with more mandates and more legal obligations. But anyway, so that's it on special ed. But also with regard to money and other issues, is Congress is having trouble once again, as they have for multiple years now, of getting any kind of a budget passed on time. And so what we're going to see again is a stopgap measure. They keep moving the deadline on what they have to extend out for funding the government. That's going to happen. And then there's a major conversation going on with appropriators in Congress about a funding bill that actually could have the potential of boosting some of the funding on domestic side that would include education. It won't be anything near what we would like it to be, which is, north of $25 billion. But it'll be a lot smaller if we succeed in getting it at all. But those debates are happening, and the objective of a lot of folks in Congress is to get it done before the end of December, before the start of the new calendar year, I'm not so sure that's going to happen. But that's kind of the lay of the land in Congress. And, we got our hopes pinned on. One of the things that we can do, Tim, is have Governor Weiss come back perhaps in early January, because I think we're going to know a lot more about some of this, and we can have a conversation with him, since he's got the game on the ground in DC always down, and he's always a very willing participant in our updates.
Well, thanks for the update there, Kevin. And yeah, we'd love to have Governor Weiss on again and get his feedback and perspective. But yeah, it sounds like the same old story, not able to come to an agreement and just sort of kicking the can down the road on when they're actually going to do something, usually right up against the deadline. If I recall, if I've seen this movie before, it's the 11th hour. So we'll keep our eye on that for you. And again, it'd be wonderful to have Governor Weiss on again next time. Let's zoom into California and talk about the new session that's beginning. Can you enlighten us on what's happening here in the state locally?
Yeah, so most of the races now, of course, have all been certified, so we kind of know the results. We know that there's at least one seat where a legislator has been sworn in, but we expect still the results of an election that had only a 20 vote margin to get contested. But almost everything else has obviously been settled, including the speakership, which the legislature on the assembly side formally voted for an agreement that will put Rob Rivas, an assembly member from San Benito County, he includes Salinas and some of those areas up on the Central Coast, northern Central Coast, to become speaker next summer. It'll be after the budget process. So Anthony Rendon will fill out his final year as Speaker of the Assembly, setting a record as the second longest tenured speaker in state history, only behind Willie Brown. So quite an accomplishment in a term limited era, because Willie Brown was only able to achieve the history making record setting tenure that he had because he served in a non-term limited environment for the most part. So big accomplishment for Speaker Anthony Rendon. But his speakership will come to the end of the summer. This will be his last budget cycle. It'll be important. I think it's real important to note that, again, I know many of our viewers have heard this, but we have a really big job ahead of us in the coming months, educating and bringing up to speed on K-12 and pre-K issues. A lot of members of the legislature, because it's the biggest turnover that we've had in the legislature since the inception of term limits, with almost 36 new members of the legislature between the two houses. So they're back. They were able to introduce a bill each in the first days. They'll come back in January and really start, the real official start to the year, if you will, when they get underway with a lot of activities, including the governor's introduction of his budget on January 10th, and then a bunch more bills. But there were a couple of bills that we're going to talk about a little bit later that are going to be of interest that did get introduced in those first days of this new 2-year legislative session.
Well, thank you for filling us in there, Kevin. And again, there's the new landscape, a lot of new players in the field. And one nice thing about this program is we'll continue on and be able to give people updates on how things are shaping up and shifting as time goes. But really appreciate that, and looking to hear more from you on California in upcoming sessions. So one thing that's front of mind for everyone, we were down at CSBA. A lot of you probably were, and cybersecurity was a big talking point there. Vernon Billy led a panel. I had asked a couple of superintendent friends what was some of the most compelling things that they had seen at the conference. And Alberto Carvalho, speaking about LAUSD's experience with the breach and basically the cyber attack that they went through, they said that was really moving for them and really alarming. So this is a big topic right now. A lot of organizations, as we've covered in the past, have asked the FCC to cover cybersecurity support for schools through the ERATE program. In fact, Doris Matsui sent in a letter last week asking for support there as well. So this is a red hot topic. And Kevin, I know you had a conversation with AASA and they had their perspective, but maybe you just talk a little bit about what you heard from them.
Yeah, it's an interesting take. I mean, there was immediately a lot of effort, and Superintendent Carvalho in LA deserves a lot of credit for trying to pull together the sentiment of at least some of the major urban school districts across the country, but a lot of districts joined him. And as you mentioned, Congresswoman Matsui, who plays a major role for Democrats on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which does have jurisdiction over the FCC, is communicating messages that are aligned with what these superintendents and districts have said, which is we need financial support because the dollar amounts we're talking about are just incredibly huge. And the notion of sort of unlocking E-rate funding to help try to deal with this, in their view, would be important. But the perspective of AASA and AESA, both of the state, rather the national organizations that represent school administrators across the country, both at the district level and at the intermediate county office level, articulated interesting opposition to using E-rate. And their basic premise is that they absolutely want there to be funding by the feds. They want help from the federal government. They believe that the sort of the locus of support from the federal government ought to be coming from the Federal Trade Commission, as well as Homeland Security, that's where the dollars ought to be coming from. What they're concerned about is E-rate and connectivity has a limited amount of funding, and that this is so huge that it will potentially drain all the resources away from other really important sort of purposes of E-rate. The reality is, if you put the right kind of funding into it, does it really matter which pot it's in? The point is that we need to do something about cybersecurity that's really serious. And I agree, maybe other agencies ought to participate, but for a local school district, you don't care what the acronym agency name is are there resources to help or not? So there's kind of that behind the scenes kind of jockeying about what's the right way to do it, while districts say, whatever you do, address it. And so we'll see how it shakes out. But I know you've been a big advocate, and obviously you've been involved with advising school districts when they get themselves into a cybersecurity problem. But more than that, Tim, you've been really involved with trying to do preventative work with school districts so they can anticipate and do all the right things they need to do in advance of that. And frankly, we need funding for that as well. Preventative steps that districts ought to be doing in anticipating this. They're just going to become a lot more frequent. So all of that's good. I'm curious your perspective about the fight for the two sides about.
Yeah, I'll just say, yeah, thank you for that, Kevin. And I'll just say, I see AASA's side. The way I view this is you can't provide people connectivity to the internet and not have it be secure. So if we want to say we want to keep things the way they were with E-rate funding, and that was giving us our wireless and our internet connectivity at schools, that's not wrong. And now we're going to ask more of that funding. Well, we would need to increase that bucket to address cybersecurity, which I believe is part of AASA's argument here. I will say that E-rate, the way it is maxed out, providing internet without cybersecurity to schools. So, where do you get additional dollars, or are you just squeezing the same orange for the juice and expecting it to do more? So I don't believe that they're wrong there, but either they would have to increase the overall dollars that are going into the E-rate program to help address this, or you're going to go to some other agencies and give them the dollars to do it. But again, we're asking schools now to parse out things that should be, in my opinion, connected. So I do appreciate the spirit of what AASA is saying, and they're not wrong that we need a lot more dollars to support this. But if two things go hand in hand, and now I've got to go to two different places to address that overall solution, it makes it tougher on the school district to navigate, right? Because I need to figure out even how I'm going to connect these two things. And I've got to have the internal resources to figure that out. And I'll use this pot of money for this part and this pot of money for this part. That just becomes tricky for them. So I believe, the spirit of AASA is correct. Although I believe it would be a little bit cleaner to keep it in the E-rate program, regardless of the red tape that exists there. And for those that have a tech background, know exactly what I'm talking about. Right. I will say this, what we have seen a little bit of action. CDE released a list of things that every school district should do to address their cybersecurity. Again, there's no funding available for that, but there are some pretty good suggestions. And by the way, the link to that article will be in the show notes. So if you're in YouTube, you click the notes and then you'll go in and see that link. And that's something you might want to share with your tech team that is fairly technical. But we also have an article just talking about some of the letters that are being written and so on. Either way, again, squeaking the wheel on this topic is the way that we're going to get the government to take action. And even if it's in two separate buckets, coming from two separate places, we need the funding to address this topic. And we need some additional expertise in K-12 to help us figure out what these sort of minimum things you need to do to address cybersecurity are. So I'll jump off my soapbox, but any final thoughts or questions on that one, Kevin, because I didn't want to leave anything out.
No, I think you've hit it. I mean, this last thing I would say to redouble your point, and again, we love the advocates at AASA are incredible. They do an incredibly great job. But the notion of any LEA having to deal with one more federal agency seems pretty daunting to me, because we know how bureaucratic any one of them can be. And if you go to a school district and say, guess what, you get to deal with not just one more, but maybe two more agencies in addition to FCC to get whatever your problem is addressed, I think is a bit much. I think we need to try to ask our government to try to do things that are streamlined in a way that addresses the needs that we have without it becoming too burdensome or complicated. So
completely agree. Yeah, completely agree. Make it easier to get the stuff that you need and access the budgets that you need to do it. I completely agree on that. So thanks, Kevin, for those points. So last time we were on, the LAO had come up with their fiscal outlook, and that was based on early projections on the fiscal outlook for next year. Can you tell us the latest there, because there's been a few changes?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing is that I think the field is pretty familiar with now is that the nonpartisan legislative analyst did come out with its multi-year forecast in the middle of November. And, it's a little bit scary news, but not a mystery. We've been reporting now month over month that ever since actually June, that revenues are coming in significantly lower than what we might have otherwise anticipated. And I use the word significantly, carefully there, because again, in the context of a $250 billion budget, to be off by a total of $7 billion over a multiple month period isn't off by that much, but it is disconcerting that they've adopted a budget, the legislature has, and the revenue assumptions they make about that budget being off into the billions of dollars is always, disconcerting. So what happened in the month of October, interestingly, is it reversed itself and we ended up being $2 billion to the positive. But people need to be careful how they read into that, because the legislative analyst was real articulate about saying that the reversal is almost a phantom reversal. It has to do with tax behavior predicated on laws that were written by the state of California to help California taxpayers get a bigger potential write-off on their federal taxes for what they're paying at the state and local level. And they created this pass-through entity device in our tax code, and it's all complicated. But the shorthand on it is to say that when and how you pay some of the tax obligations, you prepay some of your tax obligations to the state would get you better deductibility on your federal income taxes. And it shows up in a way that creates what looks like more revenue than will ultimately shake out by the end of the fiscal year. And the legislative analyst says to be sure that anomalous change with regard to taxes and tax revenue does not change their outlook for the coming fiscal year, which has us sort of upside down relative to the estimates on revenue. So the two most important things to note is, number one, their overall, the budget problems the state's talking about have less impact on schools than you might otherwise think. And it's mostly because we have a pretty big Prop 98 reserve, which protects education. There's a sizable amount of one-time money that's being spent on education that provides a cushion as you go into a year when the revenues aren't quite as much as they would otherwise be. But there are implications that we all need to be mindful of. Number one, I think it's very likely that in the governor's January budget, we will see for the first time in maybe a dozen years, no significant proposal for one-time money to come to public education in the year that starts July 1. Look for that in that January 10 budget. The other issue is that they're saying that the Prop 98 guarantee right now under the current forecast would not generate enough money to even pay for the full COLA that's being projected. Now, it's a big COLA, 8.7% is the projection by the legislative analyst. And they think Prop 98 generates enough money to only pay for about 8.3% of that. And again, that's for the fiscal year that would start next July 1. So I know that everybody's thinking about the budget that we passed last summer for the year we're in the middle of, but that process has started already for the budget that we will be talking about for next year that starts in July. And these are some of the budget dynamics that we're going to be into. And the minute January 10th takes hold, when the governor releases his plan for next year, all eyes are going to be on those issues and what is the fate of a lot of the really huge investments that the governor and the legislature have made in the current year. And what the legislative analyst is saying so far is nothing at the moment is really in jeopardy except the potential of not fully funding that COLA. But if you're talking about no new one-time money and we're talking about no new big new investments in programs, that's a pretty big change over the last few years because we've just seen a lot of money coming our way for lots of different reasons. So things are slowing down. I think the real implications may be not necessarily for the next fiscal year, but the year after. So that's kind of the update for right now. We'll have a whole lot more on this when we get into the new year.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. Really appreciate your update there. And yeah, things are sounding not as bright as they used to when we're looking at our economic forecast. So, and that just makes sense. What goes up must come down. Perhaps not as bad as we thought it might be, before we heard that from the LAO, but definitely looking for more info on that from you as we move forward. I did have a topic here that is of interest, and I want to make sure that everybody really understands what I'm saying when I say this. But the U.S. Senate unanimously voted to ban TikTok on government devices. What that means is it's a government-held device. So, if you're working for a government agency, you are not allowed to have TikTok on something that's been issued to you by the U.S. government. Don't take this as TikTok has been banned across the U.S. But we're noticing that some states, there's about 6 states that have taken action at a state level against using TikTok. And for those of you that don't know, TikTok is basically a Chinese organization that runs TikTok. And there's some concerns about how our data is being handled, or traffic that's being used, communications that are being monitored in an inappropriate way in China. And that's causing this backlash. I will say that there's no immediate action to be taken on your part, but it is something to be aware of, because you know how popular this platform is for your students and your teachers as a communication tool. And if people are thinking about technology and how it impacts our life, we're using these communication tools, and there is perhaps something that's lurking back there that could cause problems. I think this is a powerful moment. And you could very well have this come at one of your school board meetings, right? People see a headline and they don't necessarily know exactly what it means, but it could cause some stress because we know how widely used this platform is. So just take a moment. There's going to be an article, again, in the show notes explaining this in a little bit more detail. But just know that there's more, anxiety about TikTok as a platform. I will say that FCC also banned some cameras from Chinese manufacturers, ZTE, Huawei. You may have some of those in your networks. You may have been considering buying some of those cameras. The FCC just said flat out no. And that's not for government agencies. That's just a blanket no on those products, because again, they're worried about data and information that's being inappropriately used. And remember, I'm not taking a dog in the fight. I'm just letting you know, because if you as the leader of the school district get addressed, by someone with these concerns, you'll at least be in the know about, who's being targeted and why, and where these are actually being banned, instead of just sort of a blanket thing. So hopefully that helps you as we move forward. It's certainly interesting enough to read, because we've all seen TikToks and had a good time laughing or watching people recording it. Seems harmless enough, but there could be something that is not so great for us and our data that's happening in the background. So please take a moment to read that and inform yourself. Kevin, one of the big things that's being discussed right now is the facilities bond. And I believe that's Prop 28. It's coming up next November, offered by Glazer. If you could just fill us in on what that looks like for schools.
Yeah, it's actually one of the very first pieces of legislation that was introduced by Senator Steve Glazer, SB 28, that would eventually become a ballot measure. He has it targeted for the March 2024 ballot. So that ballot, people are scratching their heads saying, what about March? Is that whenever we get into a presidential election year, the primary actually is moved to March in California. And they did that some years ago in an effort to try to be more competitive and relevant in the primary process when we're picking presidents. So March will be the primary for 2024, and that's when this next bond measure would appear on the ballot under the Glazer legislation. It's not very different at all from what was Prop 13. It was the last bond measure that appeared before voters that did go down to defeat. I think it only garnered about 46% of the vote. It does need only a simple majority vote to pass, but it fell short of that back then. The thinking is that this time around, it might be better off, especially since it won't have that ballot designation Prop 13. It'll have a different number, but not 13. Anyways, we'll see what happens with it. But I will tell you that there was Senator Glazer had a bill like this last year. Assembly member Patrick O'Donnell, who is now no longer in the legislature because he was termed out, and will be getting a new chair of the Assembly Ed Committee, is the Assembly saw things a little bit differently when it comes to bonds. Glazer's bond is a bond measure that includes higher ed institutions, and the O'Donnell approach a year ago did not. And O'Donnell was really hoping for, pushing a bond measure to the voters that they could decide upon that would not have higher ed in it, other than I think community colleges. And the point is that whole battle will potentially play out again. Glazer getting this into the hopper for the legislature to consider right away ahead of anybody else's bill will give it a little bit of a lead and a lot of attention. $15.5 billion bond measure, and it's much needed, especially given the fact that this downturn in the economy means that the legislature's intent to actually fund some of the current program for modernization and new construction out of the state's general fund for a couple of years using almost $4 billion. Only 1.3 billion of that plan got implemented out of the current year budget. The rest was going to come as the economy would produce more revenue for the state of California. Obviously, that isn't happening. So we think the rest of what their stopgap approach before 2024 isn't probably going to work. So that means the state program is going to be very underfunded. We're going to need that state bond measure. So we'll see how the debate over state bonds, whether higher ed's included or not, whether some of the reforms that Senator Glazer is including again go in, whether or not the debate over and a lot of the conversation about what cost us that election in 2020 sort of continues to be debated, where we end up with a final proposal. But I'm fairly confident that the legislature and the governor will act to place a ballot measure on 2024. And we're just glad that the conversation is underway and grateful that Senator Glazer is helping to advance the cause.
Absolutely. I was just on a call with Carolyn Chow, the CBO for Palo Alto Unified, and she was just talking about, it's the facilities issues are just taking up so much of her bandwidth. So we know that's a big issue for folks out there. We hope that this has legs and will actually pass and get some relief to you all out there that are dealing with these issues. So thanks for that update, Kevin. Also you had mentioned before that there's going to be a lot more news on, what's going on in the California budget. The governor is going to release, their projection for the budget starting in July. That happens in January. You are and the team are going to do your budget workshops on that budget announcement, and that's going to happen end of January, early February timeframe. Is that right, Kevin?
Yeah, actually, just sort of in the kind of the latter part of January is when we start those budget workshops. We're going to be doing like 30 of them. There are going to be a few of them that are actually going to be done virtually. And so despite what county it says on there, we welcome people to participate in whichever one is most convenient to you. So, and again, they're free. We want to give opportunities for each of you to gather in your own counties, but there are a couple of the county offices who have opted to do them via Zoom, which in a way that's kind of good because people that maybe don't want to physically go to their own county can join those Zoom broadcasts and hear from us in the same way and give everybody access to the presentation. But it should be a very interesting budget presentation. Hopefully we'll have a link here so that you guys can register. It is open to anybody. Again, they are free, and they're produced as a courtesy of those county superintendents, of which we now have almost 40 county superintendent clients across the state.
Well, thanks for putting that on, Kevin. Always, I learned so much by attending those myself. And I'll just say it's just before the holidays. Don't let your calendar fill up. Just go ahead and click that link. It'll be in the show notes or in the email that comes out from Kevin. And go ahead and get that on your calendar now, because it'll be mid-January before you know it. And these things will be right there, and it might be trickier to fit in. So do that before the holidays if you can, and make sure you have that locked in on your calendar. So with that, everyone, I just want to say thank you so much for your continued support for us watching this program. You are our marketing team. If you don't mind, give us a little shout on social media, push this out to some of your friends who might benefit from some of this information. And if you have suggestions on topics you'd like us to cover in the future, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you so much, Kevin. I hope you have happy holidays with your family. Hope you're all safe and have a wonderful holiday as well. And we'll catch you after the holiday break.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So thanks again for joining us for another week of this broadcast.
And I just want to take a moment to remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and share this out over social media. Again, you're our marketing team. I'll also finish by saying, if you have some questions, please send them our way. We'd be happy to address them on a future broadcast. So with that, thanks everybody, and we'll talk soon.